The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and distant smoke across the settlement of Cedar Ridge, where wooden buildings stood like weathered sentinels against the vast expanse of the American frontier. In this harsh land where survival depended on community bonds and shared burdens, Margaret Sullivan had become an unwelcome reminder of broken promises and shattered dreams. At 23, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that should have made her the pride of any frontier town. Auburn hair that caught the morning light like burnished copper, green eyes that held depths of intelligence and compassion, and hands that could tend wounds as skillfully as they could weave cloth. Yet on this crisp October morning, she stood alone in her modest cabin, staring at the wedding dress that would never fulfill its purpose. 3 days had passed since Thomas Whitmore, the town's most eligible bachelor and son of the wealthiest rancher, had publicly declared their engagement void. Before the entire congregation at Sunday service, he had announced that he could not marry a woman whose sympathies lay with the Apache raiders who had been terrorizing the region. His words had cut deeper than any blade. I cannot bind myself to someone whose heart harbors treasonous compassion for our enemies. The accusation stemmed from an incident 2 weeks prior, when Margaret had been caught providing medical aid to a wounded Apache scout found near the settlement's perimeter. While others called for his immediate execution, she had quietly tended his injuries, arguing that mercy was a Christian duty regardless of the recipient's heritage. Her actions had been seen as betrayal by a community living in constant fear of Apache raids. Hey there, wonderful viewers. Before we continue with Margaret's incredible story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and become part of our growing family of story lovers. Also, drop a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I always love connecting with people from all corners of the world. Now let's dive back into this tale of courage and redemption in the Old West. Now Margaret faced the consequences of her compassion. The engagement's dissolution had left her not only heartbroken, but socially ostracized. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. The general store owner served her with cold efficiency, and even the preacher's wife had suggested she might find spiritual guidance elsewhere. In a frontier community where reputation meant survival, Margaret had become a pariah. The shame burned in her chest like a physical wound, made worse by the knowledge that her actions had been driven by genuine Christian charity. She had been raised by her late father, a circuit preacher, to believe that all souls were equal in God's eyes. Yet here, in this unforgiving wilderness, such beliefs were seen as dangerous naivety. As evening shadows lengthened across the settlement, Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto her small porch. The distant mountains stood like purple giants against the darkening sky, their peaks touched with the last golden light of day. Somewhere in those rugged heights, Apache bands moved like ghosts, their presence a constant source of terror for the settlers below. The loneliness pressed down upon her like a physical weight. She had no family left, no prospects for marriage, and now, no place in the community that had once embraced her. The future stretched before her like an empty prairie, vast and uncertain. In her darkest moments, she wondered if she should simply pack her few belongings and seek a new life in some distant city, where her reputation could not follow. It was then that she heard them, the low moans of pain carried on the night wind. Following the sound through the settlement's outskirts, past the last flickering lanterns of civilization, Margaret discovered a sight that would forever change the course of her life. There, caught in a massive thorn trap that the town's militia had constructed near the creek, were 2 young Apache prisoners. The trap was a cruel contraption of interwoven branches from honey locust trees, their 3-inch thorns designed to hold captives while inflicting maximum suffering. The male prisoner, perhaps 19 years old, bore the lean build of a warrior, his dark hair braided with eagle feathers now torn and bloodied. Beside him, a girl of no more than 16 struggled against the thorns that had pierced her deerskin dress, her face a mask of stoic endurance despite the obvious agony. Margaret's heart clenched as she recognized the deliberate cruelty of their situation. The trap had been designed not for quick death, but for prolonged suffering, a message to other Apache raiders about the fate that awaited those who threatened Cedar Ridge. The young woman's eyes, dark as midnight and filled with pain, met Margaret's across the thorny barrier, and in that moment, the word enemy seemed to lose all meaning. The discovery of the Apache siblings trapped in the thorny prison marked the beginning of Margaret's most profound moral test. As she stood in the moonlight watching their silent suffering, she understood that this moment would define not just her character, but her entire future. The settlement slept peacefully, unaware that their rejected daughter was about to make a choice that would echo through the canyons and mesas for generations to come. For 3 agonizing hours, Margaret wrestled with her conscience while the Apache brother and sister endured their torment in stoic silence. The young man, whom she would later learn was called Ayana's brother Dakota, had positioned himself to shield his sister from the worst of the Thorns, his own body bearing the brunt of the trap's cruel design. His sacrifice spoke of a love and honor that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. The girl, Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in her native tongue, possessed a dignity that remained unbroken despite her circumstances. Even as blood seeped through her torn clothing, she maintained the proud bearing of her people, her dark eyes reflecting not hatred, but a profound sadness for the cruelty that humans could inflict upon one another. Margaret found herself remembering her father's sermons about the Good Samaritan, about showing mercy to those whom society deemed unworthy of compassion. The irony was not lost on her that she, now cast out by her own people, was being called to show mercy to those her community considered mortal enemies. Perhaps it was this shared experience of rejection that allowed her to see past the barriers of race and culture to the fundamental humanity of the 2 young people before her. As the night deepened and the settlement sounds faded to silence, Margaret made her decision. She could not stand by and watch 2 young people suffer a slow, agonizing death, regardless of their heritage or the potential consequences to herself. Moving with the quiet determination that had always characterized her actions, she began to gather the tools she would need for their liberation. From her cabin, she retrieved her father's old hunting knife, its blade still sharp despite years of use. She also brought strips of clean cloth for bandages, knowing that the siblings would need immediate medical attention once freed from their thorny prison. The weight of the knife in her hand felt like the weight of destiny itself, each step toward the trap carrying her further from her old life and closer to an uncertain but morally clear future. The moon had hidden itself behind a thick bank of clouds when Margaret finally approached the thorn trap. The darkness provided cover for her actions, but it also made the work more dangerous. Each cut had to be precise, each movement calculated to avoid causing further injury to the prisoners or alerting the settlement's night watchman to her presence. Dakota's eyes widened in surprise as Margaret began cutting away the thorny branches that held him captive. He had expected death, perhaps torture, but not rescue from one of the very people who had constructed his prison. His warrior's training had prepared him for many things, but not for this act of unexpected mercy from a white woman whose own people had clearly rejected her. Ayana watched in silent amazement as Margaret worked with gentle efficiency, her movements speaking of medical training and genuine care for their welfare. The young Apache woman had heard stories of white settlers who showed kindness to her people, but she had dismissed them as myths. Now, witnessing such compassion firsthand, she began to understand that the world was more complex than the simple divisions of friend and enemy that war had created. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Each thorn had to be carefully extracted or cut away, and Margaret found herself working by touch as much as sight in the darkness. The siblings' blood stained her hands and dress, but she continued with unwavering determination, driven by a moral imperative that transcended personal safety or social acceptance. As she freed Dakota's left arm, he spoke his first words to her in broken English. "Why you help?" The question carried the weight of genuine bewilderment, for in his experience, white settlers showed mercy only when it served their own interests. Margaret paused in her work, meeting his gaze in the dim starlight, and replied simply, "Because it's right." Those 3 words contained the essence of Margaret's character and the driving force behind her actions. She was not seeking reward or recognition, nor was she motivated by political considerations or strategic advantage. She was simply a woman who could not stand by and watch suffering when she had the power to alleviate it, regardless of the personal cost. The liberation process took nearly 2 hours, each minute fraught with the danger of discovery. Margaret worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, her father's medical training serving her well as she navigated the complex web of thorns and branches. Several times, she heard the distant sound of the night watchman's footsteps, forcing her to freeze in place until the danger passed. When Dakota was finally free, he immediately turned his attention to helping Margaret liberate his sister. Despite his own injuries, he worked alongside the white woman who had risked everything to save them, their shared purpose creating a bond that transcended the artificial barriers of race and culture. Together, they carefully extracted Ayanna from the remaining thorns, their combined efforts speaking of a cooperation that would have been unthinkable just hours before. As the last of the thorny branches fell away, Ayanna collapsed into her brother's arms, her strength finally giving way after hours of stoic endurance. Margaret quickly began tending to their wounds, using the cloth strips she had brought to bind the worst of their injuries. Her gentle touch and obvious medical skill spoke of a compassion that needed no translation, and both siblings began to understand that they had been saved by someone truly extraordinary. The moment of their liberation marked more than just the freeing of two prisoners. It represented a fundamental shift in the moral landscape of the frontier. In choosing mercy over vengeance, compassion over conformity, Margaret had planted the seeds of a different kind of relationship between the white settlers and the Apache people. Her actions would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of change that would be felt for generations to come. As Dakota helped his sister to her feet, he turned to Margaret with an expression of profound gratitude. In his native language, he spoke words that she could not understand, but whose meaning was clear in his tone and manner. He was offering her something precious, the protection and friendship of his people, a gift that few white settlers had ever received, and fewer still had earned through acts of pure compassion. Ayanna, despite her weakness, managed to remove a small silver bracelet from her wrist and press it into Margaret's hands. The jewelry was clearly of great personal value, perhaps a family heirloom or a gift from someone dear to her. By offering it to Margaret, she was acknowledging a debt that could never be fully repaid, and extending an invitation to a friendship that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. Margaret accepted the bracelet with tears in her eyes, understanding the magnitude of the gift she was receiving. In a world where Apache and white settler were supposed to be mortal enemies, she had found something far more valuable than gold or land. She had found proof that human compassion could bridge any divide, heal any wound, and overcome any prejudice. The three unlikely allies stood together in the darkness, their shared experience having forged bonds that would endure long after the immediate danger had passed. Margaret knew that her actions would have consequences. That discovery would likely mean exile or worse from the only community she had ever known. But as she looked into the grateful eyes of the two young people she had saved, she felt a peace that had eluded her since her public humiliation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats in the distance reminded them all that their time was limited. The siblings needed to escape before dawn brought the risk of discovery, and Margaret needed to return to her cabin before her absence was noted. But the connection they had forged in those precious hours would endure, a secret bond that would influence the course of events in ways none of them could yet imagine. As Dakota and Ayanna prepared to disappear into the wilderness that had sheltered their people for countless generations, they carried with them a new understanding of the white settlers who had invaded their lands. Not all of these strangers were driven by greed and hatred. Some, like Margaret, possessed the same capacity for compassion and honor that the Apache valued in their own people. For Margaret, watching the siblings fade into the darkness like spirits returning to the spirit world, the night's events had revealed a truth about herself that she had never fully understood. She was not meant to be a conventional frontier wife, content to live within the narrow confines of social expectation. She was meant for something larger, something that would require all of her courage and compassion to achieve. The discovery that would change everything came 3 days after Margaret's secret act of mercy, when a cavalry patrol found the abandoned Thorn trap and the clear evidence of the prisoner's escape. Captain William Morrison, a career soldier with 20 years of frontier experience, examined the cut branches and torn cloth with the eye of a professional tracker. The precision of the cuts told him that this had not been a rescue by Apache warriors who would have simply destroyed the trap with brute force. The careful, almost surgical removal of each thorn spoke of someone with medical training and a deep concern for the prisoner's welfare. Most telling of all were the strips of white cloth that had been used as bandages, clearly torn from a woman's undergarments. Morrison's investigation quickly focused on the settlement's residents, and Margaret's recent history of Apache sympathies made her an obvious suspect. When confronted by the captain and several town leaders, she made no attempt to deny her actions. Standing in her small cabin, surrounded by men whose faces showed varying degrees of anger and disgust, she simply stated, "I could not stand by and watch two young people suffer a slow death." Her confession sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. Thomas Whitmore, her former fiancé, declared that her actions proved he had been right to break their engagement. "She has revealed herself to be a traitor to her own kind," he announced to anyone who would listen. "We are well rid of such treachery." The town council convened an emergency meeting to decide Margaret's fate. Some called for her immediate arrest and trial for treason, while others argued that exile would be sufficient punishment. The debate raged for hours, with Margaret's few remaining friends arguing that her actions, while misguided, had been motivated by Christian charity rather than malicious intent. During this tumultuous period, Margaret found herself completely isolated from the community that had once embraced her. Even the few townspeople who had previously shown her kindness now avoided her entirely, fearful that association with her would bring suspicion upon themselves. She spent her days in solitude, tending to her small garden and reading her father's old Bible, finding comfort in passages about mercy and forgiveness. It was during this dark period that the first sign of change appeared. A young Apache brave, barely more than a boy, appeared at Margaret's cabin one evening carrying a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside, she found dried meat, medicinal herbs, and a beautifully crafted pair of moccasins. The message was clear. Dakota and Ayanna had not forgotten her kindness, and their people were prepared to offer her the protection and support that her own community had withdrawn. The gifts continued to appear sporadically over the following weeks, always left in places where Margaret would find them, but never accompanied by their bearers. Each offering spoke of a gratitude that transcended language and culture, and Margaret began to understand that her act of mercy had created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate rescue of two prisoners. Meanwhile, the Apache bands in the region had begun to change their tactics in ways that puzzled the military commanders. Raids that had previously targeted civilian settlements now focused exclusively on military outposts and supply convoys. Captured soldiers reported being treated with unexpected mercy, given medical attention for their wounds, and released with messages of peace rather than being tortured or killed, as had been the previous practice. Captain Morrison, a student of Apache warfare, recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the conflict. The change was too systematic to be coincidental, too widespread to be the result of a single leader's decision. Something had happened to alter the Apache perspective on their white enemies, and he suspected that Margaret's rescue of the two prisoners was somehow connected to this transformation. The captain's suspicions were confirmed when a delegation of Apache leaders approached the settlement under a flag of truce, requesting a meeting with the woman who showed mercy to our children. The request sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge, as such direct communication between Apache and white settlers was virtually unprecedented in the region's violent history. Margaret found herself at the center of a diplomatic crisis that no one had anticipated. The town leaders who had been preparing to exile her for her treasonous actions now faced the possibility that she might be the key to ending years of bloody conflict. The irony was not lost on anyone that the woman they had rejected as a traitor might now be their salvation. The meeting was arranged for neutral ground, a small meadow halfway between the settlement and the foothills where Apache scouts had been spotted. Margaret rode out accompanied by Captain Morrison and two town council members, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had no idea what to expect from this unprecedented encounter. The Apache delegation consisted of 5 men, their faces painted for war, but their weapons conspicuously absent. At their head stood an elderly chief whose bearing spoke of great wisdom and authority. Beside him, to Margaret's amazement and joy, stood Dakota and Ayanna, their wounds healed, but their eyes still holding the memory of their ordeal and rescue. The chief, whose name was Nalnish, spoke in heavily accented English, his words carrying the weight of generations of conflict and suffering. "You are the woman who freed our children from the Thorn trap," he said, his dark eyes studying Margaret with intense curiosity. "My son and daughter have told me of your courage and kindness. We have come to understand why you did this thing." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked upon the 2 young people she had saved. They appeared healthy and strong, their natural dignity restored now that they were among their own people. Ayanna stepped forward and spoke in her native tongue, her words translated by her father. "She says that you risked everything to save strangers, that you showed the heart of a true Apache warrior." The comparison was both humbling and profound, for Margaret understood that in Apache culture, the highest praise was to be compared to a warrior. But Nalnish was not finished. My daughter also says that you have been cast out by your own people for showing mercy to ours. This troubles us greatly, for we honor those who choose compassion over hatred." What followed was a conversation that would be remembered as one of the most significant diplomatic exchanges in the history of the American frontier. Nalnish proposed something that had never been attempted before, a formal peace treaty between his band and the settlement of Cedar Ridge, with Margaret serving as a permanent liaison between the two communities. The proposal was revolutionary in its implications. Rather than the typical military-imposed ceasefire that characterized most Indian treaties, this would be a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Margaret would live between both worlds, helping to resolve conflicts before they escalated into violence and facilitating trade and communication between Apache and settler. Captain Morrison, despite his military training and natural suspicion of Apache motives, found himself intrigued by the proposal. The recent changes in Apache tactics had already reduced casualties on both sides, and a formal peace agreement could bring stability to a region that had known only conflict for decades. The economic benefits alone, the ability to trade freely and develop the land without constant fear of attack, could transform Cedar Ridge from a struggling frontier outpost into a thriving community. The town council members who had accompanied Margaret were less enthusiastic, their prejudices and fears making it difficult for them to envision peaceful coexistence with people they had been taught to regard as savage enemies. But they could not ignore the potential benefits of peace, nor could they deny that Margaret's actions had created an opportunity that might never come again. As the sun began to set over the meadow, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the two sides reached a preliminary agreement. Margaret would serve as an intermediary, spending time with both communities to build understanding and trust. The Apache would establish a permanent camp in the foothills, close enough for regular communication, but far enough to avoid accidental conflicts. Trade would begin on a small scale, with both sides contributing goods and services that the other needed. The transformation of Margaret's status from pariah to peacemaker happened with startling swiftness. The same town leaders who had been preparing to exile her now found themselves dependent on her unique position as the only person trusted by both communities. Thomas Whitmore, her former fiancé, watched in amazement as the woman he had rejected for her Apache sympathies became the most important person in the settlement. Margaret's new role required her to learn Apache customs and language, a challenge she embraced with the same determination that had driven her to free Dakota and Ayanna from their thorny prison. Ayanna became her teacher and closest friend, the bond forged in that moment of rescue deepening into a sisterhood that transcended racial boundaries. Under Ayanna's patient instruction, Margaret learned to speak the Apache language with increasing fluency. She discovered a rich culture built around respect for nature, honor in warfare, and deep spiritual connections to the land, the Apache way of life. Far from being the savage existence that white settlers imagined, was revealed to be a sophisticated society with its own laws, traditions, and moral codes. Dakota, meanwhile, served as Margaret's protector and guide during her visits to the Apache camp. The young warrior had appointed himself her guardian, a role he took with deadly seriousness. His presence ensured that Margaret was always safe among his people, and his growing reputation as a wise and honorable young man lent credibility to the peace process. The first formal trade exchange took place 6 weeks after the initial meeting, with Margaret serving as translator and mediator. The Apache brought beautifully crafted leather goods, medicinal herbs, and horses of exceptional quality. The settlers offered manufactured goods, metal tools, and surplus grain from their harvest. Both sides approached the exchange with cautious optimism, aware that they were participating in something unprecedented. Margaret watched with pride as former enemies conducted business with mutual respect and even growing friendship. She saw Apache children playing with settler children, their laughter echoing across the meadow where the trade was conducted. She witnessed Apache warriors sharing hunting techniques with settler men, and Apache women teaching settler wives the secrets of desert survival. The success of the trade exchanges led to more ambitious cooperation. When a late-season drought threatened both communities, they worked together to dig new wells and share water resources. When a band of Mexican raiders threatened the region, Apache and settler fought side by side to defend their shared territory. Each successful collaboration strengthened the bonds between the two communities and validated Margaret's belief that peace was not only possible, but profitable for all involved. As winter approached, Margaret found herself living a life she could never have imagined just months before. Instead of being the rejected bride of a narrow-minded rancher, she had become a bridge between two worlds, a woman whose courage and compassion had literally changed the course of history. The loneliness and shame that had once consumed her had been replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never experienced before. The Apache had given her a name in their language, Ishkay, which meant, the one who brings peace. The title was both an honor and a responsibility, for Margaret understood that the fragile peace she had helped create depended on her continued efforts to build understanding between the two communities. Her cabin, once a place of isolation and despair, had become a meeting place where Apache and settler could come together to resolve disputes and plan joint ventures. Margaret's medical skills, learned from her father, made her invaluable to both communities, and her reputation as a healer grew alongside her role as a peacemaker. The most profound change, however, was in Margaret herself. The woman who had once sought validation through marriage and social acceptance had discovered that true fulfillment came from serving something larger than herself. She had found her calling not in the conventional role of frontier wife and mother, but in the revolutionary role of cultural bridge builder and peace advocate. As the first snows began to fall on the high peaks surrounding Cedar Ridge, Margaret stood on her porch and reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The wedding dress that had once symbolized her hopes and dreams still hung in her closet, but it no longer represented loss and failure. Instead, it had become a reminder of how dramatically life could change when one chose courage over comfort, compassion over conformity. The revelation that would cement Margaret's legacy came during the harsh winter months, when a series of events tested the fragile peace she had helped create. A group of newcomers to Cedar Ridge, unaware of the delicate diplomatic situation, attacked an Apache hunting party, killing 2 young warriors and wounding several others. The incident threatened to destroy months of careful relationship building and return the region to its previous cycle of violence and revenge. The Apache response was swift and decisive. War parties began gathering in the foothills, their war paint and weapons making their intentions clear. The settlers, terrified by the prospect of renewed conflict, began preparing their defenses and calling for military reinforcement. The peace that had seemed so solid just days before appeared to be crumbling like a house built on sand. Margaret found herself in an impossible position, caught between 2 communities that were rapidly moving toward war. The Apache leaders, despite their respect for her, were under tremendous pressure from their own people to avenge the deaths of their warriors. The settlers, meanwhile, were demanding that she choose sides and abandon her role as mediator in favor of loyalty to her own race. It was Nalnish who provided the solution, demonstrating the wisdom that had made him a respected leader among his people. Rather than seeking immediate revenge, he proposed a formal trial according to Apache law, with Margaret serving as advocate for the accused settlers. If she could prove that the attack was the result of misunderstanding rather than malicious intent, the Apache would accept compensation rather than demanding blood vengeance. The trial was unlike anything that had ever been attempted on the American frontier. Apache and settler sat together in a great circle, listening as witnesses testified about the events leading up to the tragic confrontation. Margaret, drawing on her father's legal knowledge and her own understanding of both cultures, presented a defense that acknowledged the settlers' guilt while arguing for mercy based on their ignorance of Apache customs. The proceedings lasted 3 days, with Margaret serving not only as advocate, but as translator and cultural interpreter. She explained Apache concepts of honor and justice to the settlers, while helping the Apache understand the newcomers' fear and confusion. Her performance was masterful, demonstrating a deep understanding of both legal principles and human nature. When the trial concluded, Nalnish announced the Apache decision. The guilty settlers would pay compensation to the families of the dead warriors and would submit to a purification ceremony to cleanse them of the blood they had shed. In return, the Apache would forgive the offense and maintain the peace. It was a solution that satisfied both communities' sense of justice while avoiding the cycle of revenge that had characterized frontier conflicts for generations. The successful resolution of the crisis elevated Margaret's status to almost mythical proportions. Stories of her courage and wisdom spread throughout the territory, carried by traders, soldiers, and travelers who had witnessed the unprecedented peace between Apache and settler. She became known as the Angel of Cedar Ridge, a woman whose compassion had literally stopped a war. Marriage proposals began arriving from across the territory, as men who had heard of her remarkable story sought to win her hand. But Margaret had no interest in conventional marriage, having discovered a calling that fulfilled her in ways that domestic life never could. She had found her purpose in serving as a bridge between worlds, and she was determined to expand that mission beyond the boundaries of Cedar Ridge. Working with Nalnish and the town council, Margaret began developing a model for peaceful coexistence that could be replicated in other frontier communities. She documented the legal frameworks, cultural protocols, and economic arrangements that had made the Cedar Ridge peace possible, creating a blueprint that other settlements could follow. Her efforts attracted the attention of territorial officials and even federal authorities in Washington, who were struggling to find alternatives to the costly and ineffective military campaigns that had characterized Indian policy for decades. Margaret found herself invited to speak before congressional committees and territorial legislatures, sharing her experiences and advocating for a new approach to Indian relations based on mutual respect and economic cooperation. The irony was not lost on her that the same compassionate instincts that had made her a pariah in her own community had now made her one of the most influential women on the American frontier. The wedding dress that had once symbolized her hopes for conventional happiness had been replaced by the simple but elegant clothing that reflected her unique position between two worlds. As spring returned to the high country around Cedar Ridge, Margaret stood once again in the meadow where she had first met with Nalnish and his delegation. But now the meadow was the site of a permanent trading post, a bustling center of commerce where Apache and settler conducted business in an atmosphere of mutual respect and growing friendship. Children from both communities played together in the meadow, their laughter a testament to the possibility of a future free from the hatred and violence that had characterized the past. Margaret watched them with tears of joy in her eyes, knowing that these children would grow up in a world where the color of one's skin did not determine whether one was friend or enemy. Dakota and Ayanna had both married within their own community, but they remained Margaret's closest friends and most trusted advisors. Dakota had become a respected war leader, but his reputation was built on his skill in preventing conflicts rather than winning battles. Ayanna had become a medicine woman, combining traditional Apache healing practices with the medical knowledge she had learned from Margaret. The three of them often met in the meadow to discuss the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The peace they had created was still fragile, dependent on the continued goodwill of both communities and the careful management of inevitable conflicts. But it was real, and it was growing stronger with each passing season. Margaret's personal transformation was complete, but her mission was far from finished. She had proven that peace between Apache and settler was possible, but there were dozens of other communities throughout the territory where conflict continued to rage. Each success would make the next one easier. Each peaceful settlement would serve as an example for others to follow. As she prepared to expand her mission beyond Cedar Ridge, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had begun with a simple act of compassion, a decision to free two young people from a cruel trap. That single choice had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of hundreds of others. The rejected bride had become a peacemaker, the social outcast had become a respected leader, and the woman who had once sought validation through marriage had found her true calling in service to something far greater than herself. In freeing Dakota and Ayanna from their thorny prison, Margaret had also freed herself from the narrow confines of social expectation and discovered the limitless possibilities that awaited those brave enough to choose compassion over conformity. The story of Margaret Sullivan would be told and retold for generations, inspiring others to believe that a single act of courage could change the world. In the harsh landscape of the American frontier, where survival often seemed to depend on hatred and violence, she had proven that love and understanding were not only possible but far more powerful than any weapon ever forged. Her legacy would endure long after the frontier had been tamed and the conflicts of her era had become historical footnotes. The peace she had helped create would serve as a model for future generations, proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by those willing to risk everything for the sake of human compassion. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Margaret stood in her garden and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build understanding between divided communities. But tonight, she was content to rest in the knowledge that her choice to show mercy to two young Apache prisoners had created ripples of peace that would continue to spread long after she was gone. The wedding dress still hung in her closet, a reminder of the conventional life she had chosen to leave behind. But Margaret had no regrets about the path she had taken. She had found something far more valuable than marriage or social acceptance. She had found her purpose, her calling, and her place in the grand tapestry of human history. In the end, the rejected virgin bride had become something far greater than she had ever dreamed possible. She had become a force for peace in a world torn by conflict, a bridge between divided peoples, and a living testament to the transformative power of compassion. Her story would inspire countless others to choose love over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and courage over conformity. The thorn trap that had once held Dakota and Ayanna prisoner had long since been dismantled, its cruel purpose replaced by the trading post that now stood in the meadow. But the memory of that night when Margaret chose mercy over indifference would live forever, a reminder that even in the darkest moments a single act of kindness could light the way to a better future.